If you cut yourself badly enough today, a doctor gives you antibiotics, a class of drugs we like to think of as one of the crowning achievements of modern science. Discovered in 1928, purely accidental, a genius moment when Alexander Fleming noticed mold killing bacteria in a petri dish he forgot to clean. Except 3,000 years earlier, in Egypt, doctors were already doing something suspiciously similar, on purpose. This is the story of how ancient Egyptian medicine stumbled onto real biochemistry thousands of years before anyone knew bacteria existed, using nothing more than stale bread and careful observation. Let's start with the actual evidence, because this isn't folklore, it's written down. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains dozens of specific treatments for wounds, burns, and infections. Among them are instructions to apply moldy bread directly to open wounds, sometimes mixed with honey, sometimes with other ingredients, and left in place as a kind of primitive bandage. This wasn't an isolated folk remedy buried in a footnote. It shows up repeatedly, prescribed for exactly the kind of wounds that today we'd worry about turning septic. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains dozens of specific treatments for wounds, burns, and infections. The document itself has a strange modern history, too. It was purchased in Luxor in 1873 by German Egyptologist George Ebers, and it turned out to be less a single organized medical manual and more a working compilation, roughly 110 pages of remedies, spells, and practical instructions copied and recopied by generations of physicians, some of it likely drawing on knowledge already 1,000 years old by the time it was written down. Among its remedies is a recurring formula that shows up again and again for wounds: grease, honey, and lint, sometimes combined with bread deliberately left to grow mold. This wasn't one throwaway line. It's a documented standard of care, repeated across multiple sections of the text, prescribed for exactly the kind of open wounds that today we'd worry about turning septic. Honey on its own, as it happens, also has genuine antibacterial properties, since its low moisture content and natural acidity make it a hostile environment for many bacteria. So this wasn't just moldy bread working alone. It was a layered, empirically assembled treatment, each ingredient independently doing real biochemical work, arrived at without anyone knowing the word bacteria. Here's the question that should immediately bother you. How does a civilization with zero concept of bacteria, zero microscopes, and zero germ theory land on a treatment that modern science would later prove has genuine antibacterial power? The answer isn't mysticism. It's thousands of years of trial and error, quietly compounding into something that worked. Bread, left out in a warm, humid environment like the Nile Valley, grows mold fast, and one of the most common molds that grows on bread and grain happens to belong to the genus Penicillium, the exact same family of mold Alexander Fleming isolated in 1928 to create the first true antibiotic. Penicillium mold produces compounds that attack the cell walls of certain bacteria, stopping infections from spreading. The Egyptians had no idea why it worked. They just noticed, over countless generations of injured farmers, soldiers, and laborers, that wounds treated with certain kinds of moldy bread healed better than wounds left alone. That observation got repeated, refined, and eventually written into a medical text meant to train the next generation of physicians. And Egypt wasn't alone in this. Ancient Serbian folk medicine used moldy bread on wounds and infections for centuries. Traditional Chinese medicine used moldy soybean curd for skin infections, going back nearly as far. Different continents, different ingredients, completely independent discovery, and the same underlying biochemical trick cracked over and over by cultures that never spoke to each other.
That's the part worth sitting with for a second. This wasn't one lucky civilization stumbling onto a miracle once. This was multiple separate human populations, independently, with nothing but careful observation of which sick people got better, arriving at the same answer. When completely unconnected cultures discover the same solution independently, that's usually a sign the underlying phenomenon is real and powerful enough to notice without any theory explaining why. Now here's where the story gets scientifically interesting, because this isn't just an ancient curiosity that we've simply confirmed and moved past. In 2015, researchers at the University of Nottingham ran an experiment that made headlines in the scientific community. They took a 10th century Anglo-Saxon remedy for eye infections, a recipe involving specific plants, wine, and bile salts, brewed and applied in a very particular way, and tested it in a modern lab against MRSA, one of the most dangerous antibiotic-resistant superbugs alive today. It worked. Not folk remedy, vague anecdote worked. Laboratory confirmed, statistically measured, kills the bacteria worked against a pathogen that resists some of our most advanced modern drugs. That project, led by medievalist Christina Lee and involving microbiologists at the University of Nottingham and later Texas Tech University, has taken the name Ancientbiotics, and it's actively looking backward through historical medical texts, not as superstition to be dismissed, but as a genuine, underexplored library of empirical data. Thousands of years of humans testing plant compounds and fungal byproducts directly on real infections and writing down which ones worked. We're currently in a global crisis of antibiotic resistance, where the World Health Organization has repeatedly warned that bacteria are evolving faster than pharmaceutical companies can develop new drugs to fight them. And one of the places scientists are now looking for the next breakthrough is directly back into texts like the Ebers Papyrus, and the Egyptian formula of grease, honey, and moldy bread sits on exactly the kind of shortlist that research is starting with. So let's be honest about what this isn't. It isn't proof that ancient Egyptian doctors secretly understood microbiology. They didn't. They likely explained their success through frameworks we'd now consider spiritual or humoral, ideas about balance, purity, or divine favor, not cell walls and antibacterial compounds. The theory was wrong. The result, repeated often enough to get written down as standard practice, was real. That gap between the wrong explanation and the right result is one of the most human things about the history of medicine. You don't need to understand why something works to notice that it works, and to keep doing it, and to teach it to your children, and eventually to write it into a papyrus that survives for 3,500 years. There's something almost humbling in that. We tend to imagine scientific progress as a straight line, ignorance at the bottom, modern laboratories at the top. But ancient Egyptian physicians were running actual experiments on actual patients, refining actual treatments across generations using the only tool they had: careful attention to outcomes. That, in its own way, is the scientific method, centuries before anyone gave it that name. So the next time you take a course of antibiotics without a second thought, remember that somewhere in the Nile Valley, 3,500 years ago, someone noticed that the bread nobody wanted to eat anymore was quietly saving lives, and they were right long before anyone could explain why.